A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to some more films I'm willing to talk about again. In terms of films I'm willing to talk about again, there's a lot of unique choices out there. And it's also quite interesting to note that we're already halfway through this whole entire thing. I plan on having 37 episodes in total. And so with that in mind, I've talked a bit about the Toy Story film. But now it's time to get on to the Toy Story sequels, including Toy Story 2. Released in November 1999, exactly 4 years later, which is of course rather timely, considering how some sequels these days usually take a long time to put together. But above all, Toy Story 2 was rather timely, because it was, after all, after A Bug's Life, which had come out the year before then, in 1998. But with 1999's Toy Story 2, it sure does carry on the story of the Toy Story lore that had been previously established, also being a true sequel by all means. It actually might not necessarily be as good as the first, which is most likely what most people might think. But most people these days would actually think about the sequel being better than the first. I myself probably wouldn't say so, because for the first thing that I would have to say about this is the fact that this actually does have a bit of a different box office record and some reviews out there that most people might not really find all too well in contrast to what the first one has given us. But that's pretty much what you'd have to expect. The industry out there, in terms of filming, in terms of release statuses, and in terms of records of actual film productions going on, certainly does go for miles at a time. But Toy Story 2 is a bit of a different story in contrast to what the first one had taught us. The first one taught us a bit about how two friends should unite no matter what situation they're in. They get trapped in someone's house and they have to find a way to escape it. And upon doing so, it's a bit of a difficult challenge to try and reunite with the rest of their friends, but they somehow manage to do so even at nearly costing their own lives. But in this film, it's a bit of a different story. Much different in all cases. One that might not necessarily sound as dark or as cliche or as suspenseful as the other one, but it sure does have a bit of a sense of adventure, excitement, and action on all means. Here we do see a yard sale taking place. A yard sale that potentially puts the toys themselves at risk for getting sold off to other people, which would potentially mean one thing: the friends in the gang are potentially going to leave without even being able to say goodbye. But then of course there comes the point where Woody eventually ends up losing an arm by accident after Andy was supposed to go to a summer camp. A summer camp, of course, that is Wild West themed. But the thing is, Woody has a nightmare that he might get thrown out in the trash at some point, and eventually wakes up to find an old friend up there on the shelf covered in dust. So that pretty much is just one thing out there that you need to know, that this one does take a bit of a different turn in contrast to what the first film had given us. It still does hold off well because of the CGI being a whole lot better than the first one, and also having us some more advanced effects. It also tends to give a little bit more of a dive into the world of Buzz Lightyear, whom of course we found out was a toy all along instead of a real space ranger. But in the sequel, it would be established that the Space Ranger series entirely would actually capitalize on about a year later with Buzz Lightyear of Star Command. I will go into detail on that pretty quickly. Buzz Lightyear Star Command, which happened in 2000 and 2001, was originally meant to be a bit of an accompanying series alongside the likes of Toy Story 2, but because of some confusion that would take place, they would insist that they would have to hold off on it for a while. And so, between 2000 and 2001, they were able to successfully put together this series entirely. But unlike with most other series, which you could be able to find on streaming platforms, This is one of those rare examples that unfortunately has never been able to be put together in HD or other such graphical enhancements, and would therefore be optimal enough to be put together for different streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO Max, etc. Now that you pretty much had that part covered, being that Buzz Lightyear is a space ranger, his arch nemesis, the evil Emperor Zurg, sworn enemy of the Galactic Alliance, actually does go so far as to making a full-fledged appearance in this film, contrast to what the first actually wanted to offer at the time, but they did kind of insist that it wouldn't necessarily be possible. So they were able to hold it off until the sequel would arrive. One other thing that pretty much stands out is the fact that this film almost got completely destroyed at one point. There's a video that explains all about that. So, do be sure to check it out. But in any case, a toy collector shows up to the house to the yard sale and ends up stealing Woody after finding out that, well, he's valuable enough. Aside from the broken arm, that's pretty much just a pop scene. And then of course, you gotta know the fact, this toy collector is just one of those that actually goes out to find valuable objects and goes ahead and just goes as far as to steal Woody, drive off in a 55 Ford Mystery, a concept car that they decided to make for this movie. And then of course, well, an apartment complex in the city where no children are allowed. If Andy suspected that Woody was missing, he would not be able to find him at all. For whatever reason, they do not allow children inside the place. I mean, it's not uncommon. A lot of things tend to happen like this. But in all cases, at least for a sequel, this does give a whole different sort of context to follow by. And with just a feather as the only lead / clue as to where Woody's new whereabouts would be at, they figure out that Al's Toy Barn would certainly be where Woody is now being kept, even though that's not actually the case. But the rest of the gang would insist that they would travel all the way out to that area, to Al's Toy Barn, to go find and rescue Woody. Woody, however, is up on the top floor of that apartment building, up together with a new class of characters, whom are also accompanied by new voice actors, including the likes of Joan Cusack and Kelsey Grammer. Jesse, Bullseye, and Stinky Pete the Prospector. These three, along with Sheriff Woody, would form a team known as Woody's Roundup, which was at the time a well-known TV series that ran in the 1950s, before the space age would start to take place. And by 1957, when the Russians would launch their first ever satellite and their own ship up into space, this is when the space age would truly begin, and the race to the moon would officially begin, thereby ending what was simply known as the age of Wild West TV shows and movies. And even though those are still around even to this day, well, it was fair to say that the introduction of the space race was a whole different topic to follow up on. As explained by Prospector Pete, because of what the space race had managed to do, the series would pretty much be terminated before the final episode, known as Woody's Finest Hour, would ever be aired. And as such, well, that's just pretty much what happened. And then, of course, this is where eventually they come to the realization that they are valuable. Valuable enough to be shipped all the way off to a Japanese toy museum in Tokyo. Woody is technically bound to this whole entire thing entirely without any known given consent, even upon revealing that he does belong to a child known by the name of Andy. A lot of complications pretty much arise here and there. Some conflict between Woody and Jesse would erupt. Some talks would come by. A lot of dialogue would show up. And there's also plenty of twists that would take place. Ones, of course, that would assist in Woody's character development in this part of the series entirely. And we also just cannot forget the fact that under the guild that Woody apparently now has to learn to live with either a life of complete rich in fame lifestyle, or a life with a kid that might not necessarily last very long. It's one of those ultimatums that would happen in a film. One of those that makes an entirely good point with little to no argument. And the only context that you need to know at this point is the fact that either Woody goes and spends a lifetime out there with a lot of fame and a lot of prosperity and lots of other things out there. Or Woody could just simply go back to his normal life, which does eventually happen, but not before a lot of things typically take place. Not to mention all the events that would happen with Buzz and the rest of the gang that would be on their way to Al's toy barn to try and find Woody and rescue him from their kidnapper. That would pretty much just show up. Al McWiggins, who of course is pretty much voiced by the likes of good old Wayne Knight, whom we had previously known as Dennis Nedry from Jurassic Park, for example, and who, believe it or not, would also make an appearance in Buzz Lightyear Star Command, the animated series that would follow up after Toy Story 2 and take us into the world of Buzz Lightyear himself. Wayne Knight would voice the one and only Emperor Zurg in this series. But here in Toy Story 2, he's not. So that's probably what you need to know around here. And the fact that Toy Story 2 does introduce the character Zurg entirely and has him actually fight against Buzz Lightyear. And we're talking about a different kind of Buzz Lightyear. One, of course, whom is equipped with a special gravity belt that allows him to easily travel upward. The real Buzz Lightyear ends up getting mistaken for the other Buzz Lightyear, this newer Buzz Lightyear, that would also feel like a real Space Ranger and think like a real Space Ranger, and therefore think that the other Buzz Lightyear is some sort of AWOL Ranger. And, well, a fight seems to break out between the two. But it eventually gets down to a point that after crossing a street with a lot of cars, after entering the store, looking through all the aisles and the like to try and find Woody, it all comes down to the point where lots of conflict takes place. Lots of different changes would happen with each of the characters that would take place. From Rex simply trying to find all kinds of ways to beat a video game, from Mr. Potato Head trying to keep himself together for his newfound wife, Miss Potato Head, and then of course with the likes of Slinky and Ham and everybody else. You even have yourself the inclusion of a Barbie doll. Yeah, Mattel's own Barbie doll lineup would make an appearance in this film. We would also get to see a bunch of other things take place. But in all seriousness, the whole film comes together with Prospector P being the main antagonist, alongside Al, of course, whom is the real reason why Woody and the rest of the gang all end up in this mess to begin with. So, you could argue any way that you look at it, but I feel like that there's two antagonists in this film, not just one. In the same way that you could say that Sid and Scud are both antagonists within the first film. But Al and Prospector Pete almost tend to work in tandem, whereas Al is just another one of those gullible enough to think that the toys are not alive when they really are. So in any case, what happens is incredible by all means. Sheriff Woody ends up getting taken away by Prospector Pete and shoved into a suitcase, and Al pretty much sets off, takes the case with him to head off to the airport, to finally get to go all the way out to Japan. And then of course the rest of the gang goes after him, going so far as to simply go right after Al's car in a '79 Toyota pickup, an actual Pizza Planet delivery vehicle, similar to the first one that we saw in the first film. And it's safe to say that the Pizza Planet truck pretty much became an Easter egg from then on out. In every single Pixar film that had been released since then, we got to see the one and only Pizza Planet truck in action, or at least just as a cameo appearance in every single known Pixar film, even to this day. So by all accounts, a Pizza Planet truck chasing after a Ford mystery is pretty incredible enough. When they get to the airport, however, it's a whole different story. All the toys end up in the cargo area, lots of conveyor belts, lots of suitcases all around. And it's pretty much just a full-on battle between Woody, Pete, and Buzz. Buzz ends up finding Woody. Prospector Pete gets the first punch, knocking Buzz off of the belt. And then Woody simply just tries to fight back, but ends up getting his arm ripped up again, after it was just repaired by a professional who came over to Al's apartment. So, that's pretty much all you need to know about that. And the fact that another ultimatum would come into play. Either Woody goes to Japan in one piece, or in a bunch of them. It may not necessarily be as consequential because it wouldn't really matter either way. Al would just simply be on the plane, and Pete would just simply try to force Woody back into the box entirely. Woody refuses. Pete prepares to lash out, when all of a sudden, the rest of the toys come out with a bunch of camera equipment, lots of flashing, lots of somewhat strobe light effects, which could affect some epileptic people down the line, but by all means, this is how Prospector Pete gets defeated. He gets sent over to a backpack with another Barbie doll in it. One that is, of course, decorated in all sorts of incredible ways. So that's just pretty much how Al is defeated in this case. Not necessarily a big turnaround of events and a huge twist that is as horrific as what had happened to Sid in the first film, but it pretty much worked. So, then of course the rest of the film is about trying to reunite with the rest of the toys, just like in the first film. But in this case, instead of a large group of the gang that's involved on the move, it is only one. Jesse is the only one who is left behind inside the box itself. And the box ends up going too far and ends up getting taken to the plane itself. And Woody tries to get all the way over there and ends up eventually catching up to Jesse before the plane is scheduled for takeoff. Eventually though, the tides are turned against them in its own favor. The plane is ready for takeoff, and they end up trying to escape through the maintenance shaft, which would lead directly to the wheels. And then of course, a pretty impressive piece of suspenseful bits right there. Sudden death territory would take place, where Woody is practically threatened with a long fall that would end up in some not so well known scratches or other possible injuries on impact. Buzz and Bullseye, however, would eventually come by and attempt to rescue them both in time. But here's where the real amazing ending to this takes place. Woody ends up hoping to recreate the lost scene of the final episode in Wendy's Roundup by simply flinging over a string over at a washer and a nut. Ends up getting to it in time, and they both swing like Tarzan. Interestingly enough, because Tarzan came out the same year. But of course, this is how they pretty much escape from what could have been a disaster. If they had flown on that plane, a lot of things could have happened that could have been wrong. So how do I feel about this film compared to the first one? Well, it's simple really. It sure is quite fun, by all accounts. But do I consider it better than the first? Not really. An 8.2 out of 10 would probably be the best that I would give to this one, in contrast to the first one with a 9.6 out of 10. So in that case, that's just pretty much what you need to know about this one entirely, compared to the first. Tomorrow, however, do be prepared because the third one is underway. And I will have it out first thing tomorrow morning, right here on this channel. So if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.